deep in the Burmese jungle, an elite brigade of British soldiers were trapped. They had already achieved their mission to destroy an important Japanese railway. But instead of heading for home, their fanatical leader, Orde Wingate, decided to push them east across the Irrawaddy River. Their perilous journey was about to get much, much worse.
The Allies were basically fighting two enemies, the Japanese and the jungle.
200 miles from safety, with neither food nor radio, and surrounded by Japanese, their story is a remarkable tale of survival against the odds.
Unless we got some food and water, I was going to die in the jungle anyway.
The Japanese were howling about it, and we were ambushed.
The men were the Chindits. Their narrow escape from the Burmese jungle is one of the great tales of bravery of the Second World War. On December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. As they invaded the Asian mainland, the British experienced a succession of hammer blows to their empire in the Far East, culminating in the surrender of Singapore. 100,000 British troops were captured. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. But the Japanese were far from finished. On Christmas Day, 1942, Rangoon, the capital of Burma, was bombed. The British and 300,000 Burmese refugees fled to India. If the Japanese could not be stopped, their onward march would lead inevitably to the loss of the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, India. The British knew after such devastating losses, they had to hit back at Japan. Burma became the front line.
We knew that we had to prove that the British could come back into Burma. We knew that we had to show the Burmese that we were there.
But how to defeat the Japanese? To the British, their soldiers seemed like supermen, with a bravery and devotion to their emperor unlike anything they had encountered.
Japanese soldiers during the war, they were fanatics. They were quite happy to die for their country, but they're going to make sure that lots of other people are going to die as well.
It would take an extraordinary character to take the fight to the Japanese. Fortunately for the Allies, they had one. The British Army has thrown up its share of eccentrics throughout history. But Charles Orde Wingate takes some beating.
Wingate came into dinner practically naked, with a fly swat that he always swished around with, and he had an alarm clock hanging round his neck. And I thought, he must be mad.
He was not an impressive man physically, medium-sized and a straggly beard, and he was terribly, terribly scruffy.
Almost every Chindit has spoken about Wingate's passion for onions, part of the Chindit legend, and indeed my father would talk about seeing Wingate on parade take an onion from his pocket and munch away on it.
Wingate was a paradox. Loved by his men, he was hated by the military elite. an establishment figure who came to rail against the establishment. Wingate was raised a strict Protestant. His family committed adherence to the Plymouth Brethren. He attended Charterhouse School, but his religious upbringing meant he was mercilessly bullied.
He didn't play games because the father disapproved of it. There was an occasion when his housemaster was very worried when, on a games afternoon, Wingate was found in the chapel praying, and this was very unusual. So this Plymouth Brethren upbringing was very strong.
In 1921, he joined the Royal Military Academy in Woolwich. He was regarded as a maverick and cut an isolated figure. A few years later, Wingate signed up with the Sudan Defense Force and led long expeditions into the desert. He ordered his troops to march on a diet of dates, oranges, and cod liver oil. His Spartan regime and a belief in physical hardship became the hallmarks of his leadership.
He tested himself to the limit, absolutely, and he did expect his men to do exactly the same. And he expected all his officers to do the same, even though they hadn't got the sort of motivation that he might have had.
In 1938, Wingate was posted to Palestine, then under British rule, where he learned the art of guerrilla war. He organized violent Jewish raids on Arab insurgents and earned a reputation as a rough fighter. After Italy declared war on Britain and France in 1940, Wingate was posted to Italian-occupied Abyssinia. There, he worked closely with the deposed Emperor Haile Selassie, plotting his return to power. In Abyssinia, he developed one of his key tactical theories: going deep behind Italian lines to frighten and bluff the enemy using mobile columns. It worked. Haile Selassie was restored to the throne.
Wingate had got hold of a white horse for Haile Selassie to ride into his capital. Haile Selassie said, "I'm not going to ride the bloody horse, you can ride it and I'll go in the car." All his critics said, typical of Wingate to go and ride the white horse and let the emperor go in the car.
Wingate had made many enemies in the military, where he was considered cavalier and a loose cannon. However, he had gained one powerful fan.
Wingate's peculiar talents lent themselves to irregular warfare in many different forms, and he had probably the single most powerful ally that any military commander could have in Winston Churchill, who was also a great supporter of irregular warfare.
Meanwhile, in the Far East, the Japanese advance towards India had stalled at the Chinwin River in northern Burma. In March 1942, General Wavell, Commander-in-Chief of India, who, like Churchill, supported irregular warfare, asked Wingate to devise a way of attacking the Japanese in the jungle. After his experiences in Palestine and Abyssinia, Wingate believed he had conceived a new form of guerrilla warfare called long-range penetration.
He was capable of seeing innovations from two technological advances. One was the ability to drop supplies from aircraft, and one was long-distance wireless communications. He had the foresight to put the two together.
An intense period of training his troops began. He wanted hardened soldiers who could operate deep in the jungle for long periods of time.
Wingate was testing his men. He put them through marches. He got rid of a lot of the elderly officers who couldn't keep up.
The training was designed to remove every last vestige of civilised life. The men learned to live hard, and they learned to live on very little food, basically to live rough in the jungle.
The official name of Wingate's force was the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade. Half British, half made up of Gurkhas and Burmese rifles. But that was not the name they were to be known as.
They were called the Chindits after the name of a medieval sort of lion which was in the front of the Burmese temples. Wingate thought, well, I'm going to make a nice sign for my people. And instead of calling ourselves Chindits, it became corrupted to Chindit.
After months of training, the Chindits were primed to march into Burma. Wavell's plan was to launch a three-pronged attack on the Japanese to support the Chindit mission. But at the last minute, logistics meant the joint attack was cancelled.
Wavell came up and he intended really to say to Wingate, look, I think you ought to call it off. And Wingate knew very well, because of the antagonism towards him in the high command, the whole concept of long-range penetration, which he had developed, would be thrown out and would never be seen again.
Determined to test his theory, Wingate persuaded Wavell to greenlight the attack. Without support, some commanders considered Wingate's idea suicidal. The Chindits' mission was to cross the Chinwin River and sabotage the Japanese railway from Mandalay to Myitkyina. The British had spotted a weakness in the supply route for the Japanese troops fighting the Chinese in the north. Along the way, they were to disrupt and harass the Japanese however they could. Wingate's plan was to divide the Chindits into 7 columns of 400 men, with 100 mules each to transport weaponry and supplies. Each column was to be headed by a commander.
The personalities of the columns were determined very largely by the personalities of the commanders, and the dominant personalities were without a doubt Bernard Ferguson and 5 column, and Michael Calvert with 3 column.
I was in number 3 column, led by Major Calvert. He was an artillery officer originally, but he'd gone into this sort of specialised forces. He was as strong as an ox. He was a boxer at one time in the army, and he was a real tough nut.
Ferguson was a toff with a monocle, which he wore in the jungle. He did everything very, very correctly. We all liked Ferguson very much.
On February the 8th, 1943, Operation Longcloth began. The Chindits set off at night, marching towards the front line of the Chinwin River. Wingate had devised an incredible bluff to throw the Japanese off the main column's trail.
One column was sent off to the south with a man dressed up as a brigadier with a topi and a beard to represent Wingate. It was a wonderful deception, and so the main body of the Chindits set off, achieving complete secrecy.
The Japanese were drawn south, leaving the remaining columns to attempt to cross the Chinwin in complete secrecy. They had a limited number of inflatable boats. Getting a column of 400 men and 100 mules across turned into a logistical nightmare.
Virtually none of the Gurkhas could swim. They were all non-swimmers, and very little chaps anyway, so they couldn't even wade out very far. I thought, well, this is not much good. Here they are, they've been training for months, and they can't even cross the first river we come to.
We might have trained very hard in India. In India, we had no big rivers to cross, so it was something completely new. And I had no idea how to get animals across.
It took several days for all the columns to make it over the Chinwin. Now in enemy territory, Wingate's men marched east in their separate columns. But despite Wingate's extraordinary planning, it didn't take long for things to start to unravel. He lost contact with his decoy column in the south. They were attacked by the Japanese, who destroyed their radio. Wingate ordered the other columns to walk in single file up to 40 miles a night in dense jungle.
The only reasonable place to be in a column was in the middle. If you were in the front, you could be part of the team of slashers cutting your way through the undergrowth. If you were at the back, you would be constantly stopping and starting because of the nature of single file progress in what was known as the column snake. The conditions were absolutely horrific.
The Chindits were marching in intense tropical heat, made worse by the arrival of the monsoons.
It rained incessantly. We were always soaking wet and plastered from head to foot in mud. So when we came to a jungle stream, we just went into the stream and washed our clothes off and put them wet. The only difference then being that we were wet and clean, whereas previously we were wet and filthy.
Endless marching in appalling conditions was beginning to take its toll. Delays at the front of the column would affect all the men.
I couldn't work out why we were going so slow. So I went on to the end, and there was a British soldier half asleep with his head on the mule's backside. I laughed. It was no laughing matter to Bernard Ferguson. He said that this was disgraceful and that I should have the worst watch of the night.
The bond between the men and the mules became one of the single most important aspects of the Chindit campaign.
We could not have done a thing without our mules because they were the heroes of the campaign. They were amazing creatures.
The loads you put on them were fantastic. The radio sets and the heavy mortars, heavy machine guns, they were all carried on mules. But mules are very stubborn creatures. They used to shed their loads quite frequently, and of course that disrupted everything because while the column was going on, whoever was looking after that particular mule would have to get the loads back on again.
With fatigue setting in, the men needed food to carry on, and supplies were dangerously low. Now came the test for Wingate's big idea. They needed a good airdrop of supplies before the attack on the railway could proceed.
Each column had an RAF officer with it, And the communications and the signals were absolutely crucial, because if they didn't get their airdrop with food and ammunition, they would starve.
We would light smoke fires so that the planes could see where they were to come to, and then they'd drop the things by parachute. We'd go and collect them, and then we'd move on again, because obviously the Japs would be alerted to where we might be.
Each drop contained ammunition and basic rations, including biscuits, bully beef and tea. Column commanders could also put in special requests.
One free drop, I don't know if this was a Wingate special, was of dried onions, which came down, this enormous lump. It was a big, big lump of dried onions, which you could smell for yards. And you didn't want to carry it with you, but it went marvellously with bully beef.
After 2 weeks marching, the columns were within striking distance of the Mandalay-Michinar Railway. Wingate instructed Calvert in 3 column and Ferguson in 5 to coordinate their columns' attacks on the railway. At Nankan Station, Calvert's column were to attack the Japanese garrison, whilst Ferguson was to cut the line to the north. Calvert laid booby traps and devised a devastating ambush.
We'd set up a roadblock, and we'd only just got the roadblock in place when several truckloads of Japanese came down the road. We fired at them with mortars, hit the first truck, which blew up, and then the Japs all came out.
Gurkhas ran into the back of the truck, and one man, he jumped out of the truck, so he was very firm on his feet. The Gurkha Naik had got his head, they say the head hit the ground before the body.
Leading the attack on his 30th birthday, Calvert was personally responsible for the deaths of dozens of Japanese, earning the nickname that stuck for the rest of his career, Mad Mike.
Calvert was the epitome of the fighting soldier, and he sought out battle. Some people have described him as bloodthirsty.
Whilst Calvert's mission was completed, Ferguson was moving in on the railway further up the track.
North of Nanking, there was Ferguson's column, and his plan was to blow up a bridge, but also to make a huge explosion where the railway went along at the bottom of a cliff. And they reckoned that if they could blow up the cliff sufficiently, it would make a major stop to the railway for a long time to come. And, well, in actual fact, that attack was a complete success.
The Japanese were now alerted to the Chindits' whereabouts and were desperate for revenge.
We were ambushed, and the Japanese were howling about in the jungle, "Tommy, Tommy!" They had the battalion full screaming his head off to try and make us stand up and get shot.
Overwhelmed by the Japanese, the Chindits were forced to retreat as casualties were mounting.
We were told right from the start, before we went in, that there would be no possibility of getting the wounded out.
Their officers certainly knew that if a man couldn't march for whatever reason, a battle wound or sickness, he would be left. and that was every Chindit's worst fear.
For the mortally wounded on the Chindits' missions, terrible decisions had to be made.
There is such a bond between a healthy person and a wounded person that you have to do something. You can't just get up and leave them. So I was kneeling at the head of the stretcher. I aimed my pistol down the spine from the head and fired. His eyes shot open towards me. I closed his eye, and we proceeded on our way.
18 of them were put out of their misery by a shot through the back of their head. Now, when you come to have to shoot your own wounded, you can't speak about it hardly, can you?
Japanese attacks, disease and starvation had killed hundreds of Chindits. From the original 7 columns, only Wingate's, Ferguson's and Calvert's columns remain intact. Having accomplished their mission, the remaining Chindits' thoughts turned to home.
The problem at that stage, when they had to decide about how best to get back, was that many of the men were absolutely exhausted. They became more and more frightened. They could not face going on.
I think it was about 30 hours since I'd slept. We were up all that night, going very slowly. By the time we reached the Irrawaddy, I was very nearly fainting.
On the banks of the mighty Irrawaddy River, Wingate made an extraordinary decision. Risking all their lives, he wanted to push his men as far as he possibly could. He told his columns to cross.
Wingate's view was that he had to challenge himself to see what he could do. That was typical of him, that he was so arrogant in a way, but it's a good example of his attitude towards people and the whole attitude towards the world.
I was certainly not aware that we were going to cross the Irrawaddy. I'd have been a bit more worried if I'd known that in the first place. The Irrawaddy is a far different proposition to the Chindwin. It's nearly a mile wide.
On commandeered boats, under the cover of darkness, Calvert's column were the first to attempt to cross. But the Japanese were now alerted to their movements, and they came under heavy fire. They made it over, but Calvert had to leave 6 wounded men behind. Ferguson and Wingate's columns also crossed, but the Japanese were swarming on the eastern side, and the monsoons showed no signs of abating.
It was even worse because we were up to our ears in mud almost, and slipping and slithering all along the way, up one hill and down the next, grabbing at branches of trees to steady ourselves, and, you know, getting weaker and weaker.
Despite worsening conditions, Wingate insisted his men push on, and his orders were getting increasingly opaque.
Calvert was given basic directions, but it was up to him to determine which way he would go. Occasionally, messages came through which were Bible quotations, and we then had to find the Bible and look up the quotation to find out what it was supposed to be about.
There's little doubt that God played a big role in Wingate's attitude to life. I think the point that he was closer to God because he was better and different from all the others sinners, I suppose.
Wingate's messianic tendencies were a minor issue compared to the problem the men now faced. Their leader had taken the Chindits beyond the range of supply drops. They had to survive on whatever food they could find.
Well, it was pretty terrible, you know. We started off fit as fiddles and, you know, glossy and everything. And gradually we used up all our body fat and became terribly emaciated.
Bordering on starvation, most of the men resorted to killing their remaining mules to fend off their hunger.
The Gurkhas were absolutely horrified that we should even think of doing such a terrible thing. But we did it. It was just like trying to eat the leather, you know. Your teeth would go in and you couldn't eat it at all.
I wouldn't say that mules were tasty, no. They're a bit strong and a bit tough. But mainly we lit fires and sort of cooked them in strips.
The Chindits had formed such an emotional attachment to their mules. Many were moved to write poetry about their final demise.
Distraught, I take in your shocked and staring eyes. My pistol cracks and your head rears high. Your fading eyes entreat me. After all I've done for you, so why?
When news reached India of the appalling physical hardship the Chindits were suffering, HQ finally decided to rein Wingate in.
I received a message via the radio to the effect that we were to stop operations going any further and to make our way back to China or India.
They received a clear order, you will come back, and they couldn't challenge that, but it clarified things for them. I mean, things were very, very difficult.
They had no choice, really. Exhaustion, sickness, and slow starvation had taken its toll. And frankly, if these men were going to survive, they had to turn back.
Wingate then made another contentious decision. He told his columns to split up into small groups of 30 to 40 men to evade the Japanese. The units were told to march to Allied lines by whichever route they chose.
I felt that we had a far better chance if we tried to keep together as a fighting unit, bearing in mind that we were going to have to live off the land all the way back to India or China or what have you.
After 2 months in the jungle, and with hundreds of miles ahead of them, the epic retreat began.
The great fear was to give in to sickness on the way. Most men had had several bouts of malaria. Most men had dysentery, jungle sores, fevers, and keeping going with virtually no food in those conditions, being actively hunted by the Japanese, it was a very tough call to get home to safety, I think.
The majority of dispersal units tried to go back the way they had come, across the Irrawaddy, now swarming with Japanese, expecting their return. Other units chose to head north towards the Shui River in the hope of reaching the safety of China.
This Shui was a lethally fast river. My men fired the grapnel across. They had a little rubber dinghy, and the rubber dinghy was hauled across hand over hand to the beach the other side. The two men who should have been taking the boat back for the next lot, I don't know, maybe they let go, maybe they were caught in this very strong river. I just got 6 men now, the rest were the other side.
Bernard Ferguson took charge of a dispersal unit, which also faced huge difficulties trying to cross the fast-flowing Shui.
They thought they got across, but found that they were only at an island in the middle. The men were in such a panic that they would not go on, and in the end they had to be left and they were captured.
Heading in the other direction towards India, Alec Gibson's unit reached the Irrawaddy and found the Japanese had ordered all the boats onto the western bank. They had no choice but to swim for it.
We set off one night. I lost consciousness somewhere during the swim. I came to the following morning, lying on the side of the banks of the river. I realised that I was still on the eastern bank of the river and I hadn't crossed the river at all.
Faced with an impossible river crossing, many soldiers in Mad Mike Calvert's unit were left to their fate in the jungle.
They hadn't been wounded. They weren't suffering from any illness, and yet they'd lost the will to live. All their desire had been sucked out of them, as it were. When men come to that stage, your life is something you hang on to as desperately as you can. That's the last thing you give up. So that's a measure of the fearsome hardship to which we were subjected.
One dispersal unit, with almost every man in a desperate state, resorted to drastic measures.
One of the columns going to the north managed to find a place where there was quite a long flat space. So they spelt out on the ground, "Plain land here now." This wonderful pilot, in fact, did land there and took off all their wounded.
Some were less lucky. Bill Smiley was suffering from vitamin B deficiency and had become separated from most of his unit.
I began to get swollen feet and I lost central vision. This was very, very. And then I found a little stream. I lay down there, slept under my blanket, woke up in the morning, and I was crawling with leeches. I took off all my clothes and I shaved myself. They fell off like grapes. Plop, plop, plop. I suppose the leeches gave a kind of leech's cure. My eyesight, my central vision was restored.
Stranded on the eastern banks of the Irrawaddy, Alec Gibson had to rely on the locals for food.
We were getting very weak. We'd had nothing to eat for about 3 days. We came to a village, so we went in to try and get some food. There were some Japanese troops who grabbed us, and that was that. We were then prisoners.
Alec Gibson suffered for over 2 years as a Japanese prisoner of war.
I was in Rangoon jail. I was put into solitary confinement. Every time you didn't do what they wanted you to do and you had no idea what they were talking about, you got bashed up. They were sadists from a Western point of view, but from their point of view, they used to bash up their own people.
Around 600 of Wingate's Chindits from Operation Longcloth became Japanese prisoners of war. On the 15th of April, 1943, the remnants of Mike Calvert's unit were the first to emerge from the jungle. They had walked over 1,000 miles in some of the worst conditions on Earth. Ferguson also made it. And 10 days later, Orde Wingate swam the Chinwind to safety.
Wingate got across the Chinwind and he landed on the far side on the sand, and he started leaping in the air because he had bare feet and the sand was so hot. But everyone asked when they got back, has Wingate got back?
One man's family were told their son had died in the jungle. He, however, had other ideas.
I had one page in my notebook with a river each side, don't cross a river, and just keep going from day to day. And the whole thing was day to day.
Walking from village to village, Bill Smiley was taken in by the local tribes who fed him and allowed him to rest until he could carry on.
For the next 2 or 3 months, I've rather lost track of time, I was in the headman's houses of the Kachin. 3 men walked in, talking loudly, dressed as Japanese. My only weapon was a pistol, which wasn't much use, because it only had about 3 rounds left in it, and a grenade.
There had been an ambush in the neighboring village, and for a joke, the local tribesmen had dressed as Japanese to scare Bill.
I produced my grenade and rather shakily trying to get the pin. They stopped laughing. It wasn't funny, yes. But actually it was quite a good tactic, because if you have a live grenade in your hand, you've got bargaining power.
Bill Smiley walked out of the jungle a remarkable 4 months after the Chindit mission began. Reports reached the British in India, and they arranged a welcoming gift.
They sent back a group with bully beef, and within 3 days I was dancing, yes. My feet had gone down just like that.
From the entire Chindit mission, almost 1,000 men were either killed or captured, and 600 of the survivors never saw active service again.
When Wingate got back, he had lost a third of his force, and he quite expected to be court-martialed. Instead of this, he was taken for a press conference in Delhi, saying, here was at last a British unit, it had panache, it had cheek, and it succeeded. And suddenly the Chindits overnight became almost world heroes.
The Chindits were seized upon by the Allied propaganda machine as the first positive news to come out of the war with Japan. Psychologically, this was a massive boost to the Allied campaign in the Far East.
The thing that the Chindits achieved was that they proved that it was possible to work in jungle territory, particularly with air supply, and that the Japs themselves were not invincible.
After weeks recuperating in hospital, Wingate returned to India, now as Major General. He led another Chindit mission, this time using American air support to fly gliders behind enemy lines. Then, tragically, at the height of his career, Wingate was killed when his plane crashed into the mountains of northeast India. In dying so young, Wingate entered the pantheon of extraordinary British generals. He was an innovator whose ideas would inspire special forces operations for generations to come.
Ferguson said, you know, some people are good at planning, some people are good at training, some people are good at fighting. Wingate was brilliant at all three.
He was, a real character, and gave you every confidence. We'd have followed him anywhere.
He was a wonderful leader. We could see the genius, because it really was genius behind Wingate's ideas.
I think that there can be few parallels in military history of a commander who has been so loved as Wingate by his men. He was special, and the men who served with him became special as a result.
For the Chindits who fought with Wingate, the terrible hardships they experienced live with them still.
After the war, I was never physically wounded, but I was wounded in mind quite a bit, because I used to have nightmares and scream and shout in the middle of the night, and went on for many, many years after the war.
I found it very difficult to talk to anybody about my experiences in Burma and in the prison camp. I never said anything to my wife, my children, until 40 years afterwards, when I went on a pilgrimage to visit the war graves in Burma. And I felt then that I had a duty to talk out and let people know what went on during that period.
Orde Wingate's first Chindit expedition became one of the great narrow escapes of the Second World War. His men may have paid a huge price, but more than anything else, the Chindits had shown the world that the Japanese could be beaten in the jungle.